Kodak didn't just dominate photography, it defined it. For nearly a century, if you took a photo, you were inside Kodak's world, whether you realized it or not. You bought a Kodak camera, you loaded it with Kodak film, you sent it back to Kodak for development. And every single step put money back into the same company. This wasn't luck, it was design. Because Kodak wasn't built like a normal business, it was built like a system, a closed loop. You press the button, Kodak does the rest. That famous slogan wasn't just marketing, it was control. Here's how powerful that control really was. By the mid-20th century, Kodak controlled around 85 to 90% of film sales in the United States. Globally, it was still dominant. When people said film, they didn't mean a category, they meant Kodak. Like saying Google instead of search or iPhone instead of smartphone. But here's where things get interesting. The camera was never the main business. It was just the entry point. The real money came later. Every roll of film had to be replaced. Every photo had to be developed. Every memory had to be printed. And each of those steps was another transaction. Think about it like this. Imagine buying a pen that forces you to keep buying ink from the same company forever. Now imagine billions of people doing that. That was Kodak, and the numbers reflected it. At its peak, Kodak wasn't just profitable, it was printing money. Profit margins were so high that executives joked the company was too easy, not because they weren't smart, but because the system was that good. And that's exactly where the problem begins. Because when a system works this well, you don't want to change it. You protect it. You optimize it. You build your entire world around it. And Kodak did exactly that. In Rochester, New York, Kodak wasn't just an employer, it was the economy. At one point, over 60,000 people in a single city worked for Kodak. Think about that. Entire neighborhoods, families, generations, all tied to one company. A job at Kodak didn't just pay well, it meant security. Good salary, healthcare, pension. People didn't switch jobs, they stayed for life. So now imagine what happens when a company like that faces change. Because this wasn't just a business anymore, it was a machine supporting thousands of employees, an entire city, and decades of stability. And machines like that don't turn easily. Inside Kodak, everything was built around film. The factories, the chemistry labs, the supply chains, the expertise. Even the people running the company had built their entire careers on film. Their knowledge, their success, their identity all tied to one thing. Film wasn't just a product, it was the foundation. So what happens when the foundation itself is threatened? Because here's the part most people never think about. Kodak wasn't just selling photos, it was selling a process, a physical process. Chemicals, materials, manufacturing, all of it required scale. All of it required infrastructure, and all of it made money. Consistently, predictably, for decades. Now pause for a second. If your entire company, your employees, your city, your identity depended on one system that worked perfectly, would you risk destroying it? Or would you protect it for as long as possible? Because the moment you stop protecting it, you might lose everything. And that's what made Kodak so powerful, but also what made it so vulnerable. They didn't just build a successful company, they built a system so perfect it left them with no easy way out. And just as that system reached its peak, something appeared that didn't fit into it at all. Something that didn't need film, didn't need chemicals, didn't need Kodak. And when it arrived, Kodak didn't ignore it. They understood it immediately. And that's exactly why it scared them. It started with something small. Not a product launch, not a big announcement, just a quiet assignment inside a lab. In 1975, a 24-year-old engineer named Steve Sasson was given a task. No pressure, no expectations, just see what you can do with this. What he was given didn't look revolutionary. And it was a CCD sensor, a new piece of technology that could capture light and turn it into electrical signals. At the time, most people didn't know what to do with it. It was experimental, unproven, almost irrelevant. But Sasson saw something different. He didn't see a component, he saw a possibility. So he started building. Not a polished product, not something ready for customers, just a prototype. It took months, wires, circuits, trial and error, and eventually he created something no one had ever seen before: the first digital camera. Now, if you saw it today, you'd probably laugh. It weighed about 8 pounds, captured images at 0.01 megapixels, took 23 seconds to process a single photo, and instead of storing images on memory cards, it saved them onto a cassette tape. It wasn't impressive, it wasn't practical, it wasn't even close to replacing film. But that's not what made it dangerous. What made it dangerous was what it didn't need. No film, no chemicals, no development process. Just light turned into data. And Sasson understood what that meant. Even in its crude form, this wasn't just a new camera, it was a completely different way of capturing images. So he did what any engineer would do. He took it to management. Now imagine that moment. You're sitting in a room. In front of you is a young engineer holding a device that doesn't look impressive but represents something far bigger. He explains, this could be the future of photography. And for a second, you can see it. No film, instant images, electronic storage. It sounds unrealistic, but also inevitable. And that's exactly the problem. Because Kodak didn't just see a new invention, they saw the consequences. If this worked, film would disappear, processing would disappear, the entire system they built would disappear. And here's what most people misunderstand. Kodak didn't dismiss the technology because it was bad. They dismissed it because they understood it too well. They ran the numbers and the math was brutal. Film accounted for the majority of Kodak's profits, not just a portion, the majority. Every photo taken on film meant continuous revenue. Digital? You buy a device once, and that's it. No repeat purchases, no ongoing process, no ecosystem. It didn't just threaten Kodak's business, it erased it. So the question wasn't, is this technology important? The question was, what happens to us if it succeeds? And the answer was clear. If Kodak embraced digital fully, they would have to destroy their most profitable product. Not gradually, not partially, completely. And that's not innovation. That's self-destruction. So what do you do when the future requires you to erase yourself? Kodak chose a middle path. They didn't reject digital, but they didn't embrace it either. They filed patents, continued research, kept the technology contained, almost like they were waiting for the right time, waiting for the technology to mature, waiting for certainty. But technological shifts don't wait for you to feel comfortable. While Kodak hesitated, the world kept moving, and inside the company, something subtle started to happen. Digital wasn't treated like the future. It was treated like a threat. Engineers working on film were rewarded, promoted, respected. Engineers working on digital were sidelined, underfunded, seen as working on something uncertain. And that's how the trap tightened. Kodak didn't kill digital, they slowed it down, they contained it, they delayed it. And in doing so, they gave everyone else time to catch up. Sony, Canon, Nikon, companies that didn't depend on film the way Kodak did, companies that had nothing to lose. They looked at digital and saw opportunity. Kodak looked at digital and saw sacrifice. And that difference changed everything. Because from that moment on, it wasn't about who invented the future. It was about who was willing to embrace it. And Kodak wasn't ready to pay that price. By the early 1980s, Kodak wasn't just successful, it was comfortable. Decades of dominance had created something dangerous. Not weakness, not incompetence, something worse. Certainty. Inside Kodak, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt predictable. Film had worked for generations, sales were still strong, profits were still flowing. From the outside, nothing looked broken. And that's exactly why no one felt the need to fix anything. Because when a system keeps working, you stop questioning it. You stop challenging it. You start assuming it will always be there. And Kodak's system had been working for almost a century. But quietly, something had already changed. Not inside Kodak, outside it. While Kodak was protecting its system, others were preparing to replace it. The first real signal didn't come from digital, it came from competition. In the 1980s, Fujifilm entered Kodak's territory, not as a small player, but as a serious threat. Their film was good, sometimes better, and more importantly, it was cheaper. For the first time in decades, Kodak wasn't untouchable. And the response? They didn't reinvent, they defended. They filed complaints, pushed for trade protection, tried to hold their position instead of redefining it. Because when you're used to winning, your instinct isn't to change the game, it's to protect your lead. And that instinct is exactly what tightened the trap. Because while Kodak focused on protecting film, the real shift was happening somewhere else. Digital technology wasn't improving slowly anymore, it was accelerating. Sensors were getting better, storage was getting cheaper, processing was getting faster, and suddenly, what once looked like a toy started looking viable. And when something becomes viable, it becomes dangerous. By the early 1990s, digital cameras were no longer just experiments. They were entering the market. Still expensive, still limited, still imperfect. But they worked. And more importantly, they were improving fast. Now the pressure really built. Because Kodak could see all of this happening. They had the data, the engineers, the patents. They weren't blind, but they were divided. Inside Kodak, two worlds were colliding. On one side, the old guard, executives who built their careers on film, people who understood chemistry, manufacturing, physical processes. Their success, their expertise, their identity all came from one thing: film. On the other side, the future. Digital engineers, new ideas, uncertain markets, lower margins. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The future didn't just threaten Kodak's business, it threatened its people. Because if digital won, and everything the old guard had built became irrelevant. And that's not just a strategic problem, that's a human one. So decisions slowed down. Not because people were lazy or didn't care, but because every decision had consequences. Invest more in digital? You weaken film? Protect film? You fall behind in digital. There was no move that didn't cost something, and when every option comes with loss, people hesitate. So Kodak tried to balance both worlds. They launched digital products but never fully committed. Invested in new technology but kept prioritizing film. Acknowledged the future but refused to let go of the past. And for a while it looked like it might work. Because film didn't disappear overnight. It declined slowly, just enough to create doubt. And slow decline is the most dangerous kind. It doesn't force action. It doesn't create urgency. It gives you time to keep believing things will stabilize, but they don't. By the late 1990s, the trend was undeniable. Film sales were falling, digital adoption was rising, and the gap between Kodak and its competitors was growing, because while Kodak was balancing, others were committing. Sony pushed deeper into digital imaging. Canon refined its sensors and cameras. Nikon focused aggressively on performance. They weren't protecting anything, so they moved faster. And speed is what decides transitions like this. Not who starts first, but who commits first. Kodak had started first, but they never committed. And that hesitation cost them time. Time their competitors used to build the future. By the early 2000s, Kodak finally made a decision. They would go all in on digital, but by then, it wasn't a bold move. It was a reaction. Because when you move out of necessity, you're already behind. And what happened next wasn't just competition. It was something Kodak never saw coming. Something that didn't just change photography, but erased the need for cameras entirely. Kodak finally made the decision it had been avoiding for years. By the early 2000s, the company announced it would go all in on digital. Executives spoke about transformation, reinvention, a new future. On paper, it sounded bold. In reality, it was late. Because by the time Kodak committed, the market had already moved. Competitors weren't experimenting anymore, they were leading. Canon, Sony, and Nikon had spent years refining their technology while Kodak hesitated. They had better sensors, better software, stronger positioning. Kodak wasn't entering a new market. It was entering someone else's territory. And the economics were completely different. Film had been a dream business. High margins, recurring revenue, predictable demand. Digital was the opposite. Lower margins, higher competition, faster product cycles, constant innovation just to stay relevant. Kodak was trying to replace a system that printed money with one that barely made it, and they had to do it while their old system was collapsing. So they pushed forward. They launched digital cameras, built photo kiosks, created online platforms for sharing images. From the outside, it looked like progress, but underneath, the numbers told a different story. Film revenue kept falling year after year, quietly at first, then faster, and digital wasn't filling the gap. Because every digital camera sold didn't just add revenue, it replaced future revenue Kodak used to depend on. Every step forward weakened them. This wasn't transformation, it was erosion. And then something happened that made the situation impossible. The rules changed again. Because just as Kodak was trying to catch up in digital cameras, the camera itself started disappearing. Phones began to include cameras. At first, they were terrible. Low quality, limited use, more of a novelty than a real tool, but just like digital cameras years earlier, they improved. Faster than expected. And then came the shift Kodak never truly prepared for. Photography stopped being about capturing moments. It became about sharing them. Instantly, effortlessly, everywhere. You didn't take a photo to print it anymore. You took it to send it, to post it, to store it digitally. And suddenly, the entire idea of a dedicated camera started to feel unnecessary. Why carry a separate device when your phone could do everything? Better yet, why wait to see your photos when you could see them instantly? This wasn't just a new competitor, it was a completely new behavior, and Kodak had no place in it. They didn't control the devices, the platforms, or the ecosystem. The system they had built over a century, film, processing, printing, was no longer part of the equation. It didn't fit anymore. And when a system stops fitting the world, it doesn't slowly adapt. It collapses. Kodak's decline accelerated. Layoffs became constant. Thousands of jobs disappeared. Facilities shut down. Entire departments vanished. In Rochester, what once felt permanent started to feel fragile, then unstable, then gone. By 2012, the company filed for bankruptcy, and from a $31 billion giant to a shadow of itself. From 140,000 employees to a fraction of that. And the most unsettling part wasn't just that it happened, it was how predictable it looked in hindsight. Kodak had seen the future. They had built it. They had understood it. But they couldn't fully embrace it without destroying what they already had. And by the time they were forced to move, the future no longer needed them. That's what made the collapse so complete. It wasn't just that Kodak lost, it was that the world moved on and left them behind completely. Because in the end, Kodak didn't fail in a single moment. It failed gradually, then suddenly. And by the time it realized the trap it was in, there was no way out.